Recent events have led to the belief that there's coming a major battle somewhere in the vicinity of where I'm standing. In fact, this entire area one day will be covered with troops. It will be covered with armies and soldiers in one of the biggest battles of biblical history, called the Battle of Gog and Magog. I'm coming to you from the area of Bashan, which is in the northern part of Israel, also known as the Golan Heights, which will be a central area where this battle will be located.
About the time of the end, the biblical prophet Ezekiel tells of a future invasion of Israel by a vast coalition of nations, known as the Battle of Gog and Magog. We find this in Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. As we read the headlines in the newspapers of today and witness the conflicts in the Middle East, it's not hard to imagine that this invasion, prophesied over 2,600 years ago, could be fulfilled in the immediate future.
We're in the house, actually the area of the home of the second president of Israel, Ben Zvi, and we're in a very interesting place, and that is the place that houses what is called the Ezekiel tiles, the 81 tablets that are on basalt stone and that are directly in front of me here. And while Charlie shows you these, let me read what it says. These inscribed marble tiles are reputed to have come from the traditional tomb of the prophet Ezekiel in Kafar al-Kafil on the Euphrates River in Iraq. They have not yet been dated precisely, but many scholars have suggested the 10th century at the earliest. The tomb of Ezekiel is first mentioned in the Igaret Rav Sharia Goan in the year 987 and is described in detail in the accounts of Jewish travelers in the Middle Ages. Considered a holy place until recent years, Jews visited the tombs on pilgrimages, particularly on the holidays of Shavuot, which is Pentecost. The story of the acquisition of the Ezekiel tiles extends over a period of some 40 years. During World War II, David HaKohen was in charge of Soul Binah building operations in the countries of Syria and Lebanon. His interest in the history of the Middle East led him to purchase local antiquities. A Lebanese engineer told him of the existence of a set of marble tiles on which chapters from the book of Ezekiel were engraved in relief Hebrew script. The tiles were in the possession of a woman who had acquired them from her father-in-law, a collector of antiquities. The woman refused to sell the tiles, but several years later she contacted David HaKohen and said, "These tiles must be in the land of Israel." HaKohen purchased the tiles in 1947 through the intermediary of a family in Beirut who paid £2 for them and stored them for safe keeping. Only in 1953 was it possible to transfer the tiles from Lebanon to Israel through the good auspices of Archbishop Georgios Hakim, the Greek Catholic Patriarch. All the tiles, with two exceptions, were given to Yitzhak ben Zvi, the second president of Israel, and a noted historian of the land of Israel. After his death, they became the property of Yad Yitzhak ben Zvi, which is where we are now, the home and the area where he lived. The interesting thing about these tiles are that the letters themselves are raised letters. They're not carved into the tablets, but they're actually raised letters. And the other point that's interesting, if you look at them carefully, is they do not contain, of course, the dots that make up the vowel lettering of modern Hebrew. And this particular type of script that you see on the tablets is very similar to some of the modern Hebrew that is used today that came into existence after around, let's say, the 6th century or so. From like the 5th and 6th century before, the Hebrew script, the styling of the letters was different than this right here, and so this is somewhat different. This is a different type of script from the earlier script that would have been used back, let's say, in the Roman period or whatever, and this is more of the what we call the modern Hebrew script. So these are the tiles, or what they call the tablets or the tiles of Ezekiel, here in this beautiful surrounding back home in the land of Israel.
Ezekiel 36 and 37 predicts a gathering of the Jews to the nation of Israel, which will be followed by this massive invasion. For 19 centuries, the Jewish people were scattered throughout the world, and until May 14, 1948, there was no nation of Israel to invade. With the nation of Israel now a reality, the stage seems set for that war which could usher in the tribulation and the rise of the Antichrist, a war which will end with the destruction of Israel's enemies by God Himself.
One of the greatest prophets of the Bible was without a doubt the prophet Ezekiel. The prophet Ezekiel was a priest, he along with Jeremiah. He was taken into Babylonian captivity, and one day while down at one of the great rivers of that area, he experienced a vision from God. In fact, the entire book of Ezekiel is a series of prophecies and visions by this great, wonderful Old Testament prophet. He was the first man to see cherubim carrying the throne of God. The Jewish people call this the Merkabah, when God's throne becomes a chariot. And from chapter 1 all the way through, this great prophet, you can actually divide his book up into several different sections. As a matter of fact, let's look at that right now. He talks about Israel's captivity in chapter 1 through chapter 24, and he gives Israel the reason why they went into captivity. Then in Ezekiel chapters 25 through chapter 32, he begins to deal with the judgment of the nations who come against Israel, what will happen to them, their judgment for mistreating God's people. And then in the book of Ezekiel chapters 33 through 39, he deals with Israel in the last days prior to the return of their Messiah. And then chapters 40 through 48 are extremely fascinating because they deal with what's called the millennial temple, the temple that will be built one day in Jerusalem at the return of the Lord during the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now, what we want to key up on today is chapters 35 all the way through to chapters 48. And we're going to divide that up into 4 sections. We're going to be dealing with the dividing of the land of Israel, which I believe is in the process of taking place even now while we speak, and will in the near future. Then we're going to be talking about how that the Jews survived the Holocaust, which is the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. Then we're going to be talking about the famous war of Gog and Magog, which is Ezekiel chapters 38 and 39. And we're going to conclude in Jerusalem talking about the millennial reign, or the temple that's going to be built there one day. Now, the first place that we have to begin when we talk about the nation of Israel is talk about Ezekiel chapter 37. Ezekiel 37 is a vision of the Valley of Dry Bones. Days. It's also interesting to note, only as a point of interest, that it talks about that the stick of Joseph in the hand of Ephraim would be put with the stick of Judah, and they would be together. Now, there are people who believe, and it's a controversial teaching, that Joseph and Ephraim, or what we say Ephraim and Manasseh, are a picture of America and Britain. Well, it's interesting that Britain and America are the only 2 nations on the face of the earth that stand with the nation of Israel. So there may be a cryptic allusion, if I can say it that way, to the future of how two nations would stand with Israel. And Britain and America are honestly the only two friends this nation has. The other nations predominantly are either anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, or they just don't like the Jewish people in general or the nation of Israel in general. Now, so God brought them back. Now, here's what happens. You can't miss this point. After God brings the Hebrew people back to this land, there is a struggle that begins to ensue over dividing the land up. Now, that struggle is pictured in Ezekiel chapters 35 and 36. Now, this is where I personally believe we are at prophetically right now. The Holocaust has already happened. That's in the past. They're now a great army. They're in the land of Israel. That's chapter 37. But in chapter 35 and 36, the prophet begins to talk about a prophecy concerning Mount Seir. Now, if we go back and study, and I won't have time to do this on this particular teaching, but you can do this on your own. Edom, the area of Edom, is where Mount Seir is located. Now, who were the Edomites? The Edomites were the descendants of a man by the name of Esau. You know, there was Jacob and Esau that had a conflict with each other. Jacob took his brother's birthright and blessing. Esau hated him for it. And of course, that started a little bit of animosity between what we now know today as the Arab people and the Jewish people. But Mount Seir is located today in the country of Jordan. Now, when you begin to read a prophecy that's 2,500 years old, you have to ask yourself, who are they talking about here? Because some of the names that existed back in that day may be different than modern names today. Well, let me say this to you, and I hope you trust me when I tell you this, because we did an in-depth research on Edom. We did an in-depth research on Esau. We did an in-depth research on Mount Seir. And basically, here's what you come up with today. The people who call themselves Palestinians, who live in the nation of Israel today, in what is called the West Bank, or what is called the Gaza Strip, those individuals who classify themselves as Palestinians, being an Arab Christian or a Muslim that lived in Israel prior to 1948. When you hear someone say, I'm a Palestinian, they basically are saying, our family lived here before the Jews lived here and before Israel became a nation. So those individuals who consider themselves Palestinians would actually be descendants of Esau, or they would be classified Mount Seir today. Now, the reason I'm saying that is when you start reading Ezekiel chapter 35 and 36, you start seeing a conflict develop that the prophet talks about, of how somebody from Mount Seir, the Edomites, if you please, are going to try to split the nation of Israel and make it two nations. Here's some of the verses that I want to read to you. First of all, God says, you've had a perpetual hatred against the children of Israel. You know, the conflict you see going on in Israel today between what is called the Jews and the Palestinians, it's really not a new conflict. It goes back all the way between Jacob and Esau and their descendants. Two brothers that are wrestling for a piece of property. But let's read the scripture now. Here's what it says. Because you have said, and this is Mount Seir or Edom, because you have said, these two nations and these two countries shall be mine, and we will possess it, whereas the Lord was there. And it says, Son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel. Hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord, because the enemy has said, aha, the ancient high places are ours for a possession. Ezekiel 36, 1 and 2. Now let's put this together, because what they're saying here is this. They're saying there is a nation called Israel, but we're going to divide that nation up into two parts. We're going to give them one part, we're going to take another part. And then they say, watch this, these two nations will be ours. Wow. In other words, after we get what we want, we're going to go after them, and we're going to own both of them. And that's really the rhetoric that you hear from some of the more fanatical people that are descendants of Esau, even in this country. Now, here's what else is interesting. Notice what it says. Even the ancient high places are ours for a possession. Do you know where the ancient high places are? The ancient high places, according to the biblical term, is the area called Judea and Samaria. Judea and Samaria today is known as the West Bank. And the West Bank is the area that's very controversial right now, where many of the Palestinians live, that Israel annexed it in right after the 1967 war. It used to be the country of Jordan, but Israel annexed all that property in, and the Jordan River today becomes a dividing line between the country of Jordan, or ancient Mount Seir, if I can say it that way, and the country of Israel. And the West Bank is that controversial area where Ramallah, Nablus, and Hebron and some of those cities are. And that's the second territory they're fighting over. They're fighting over Gaza, which really doesn't have a lot of biblical connotation to it, except the fact the ancient Philistines lived there. But the West Bank is biblical history. It's the ancient high places. And this is where, according to the prophecy, that the real battle is going to take place. This is where the real conflict is going to come down. It has to do over the area of ancient Judea and Samaria. Now, this gets more interesting the deeper you go into it. Now, watch this verse here. Ezekiel says, they have swallowed you up on every side. In other words, they're trying to take over the Gaza area. Then they want the West Bank area. Then they want, Syria wants the Golan Heights. So they're trying to take you over on every side, that you might be a possession unto the residue of the heathen. In other words, and send you back to the Gentile nations where you came from. Send you out of Israel. This is what he's saying here. Now notice what happens. You are taken up, he's speaking to Israel here, you're taken up with the lips of talkers that are an infamy of the people. Watch this. Ezekiel says they've swallowed you on every side, and they say that you have devoured and bereaved the nations. What did they accuse the Jews of? Trouble. Every time you turn the news on, you see someone from Iran, someone from Iraq, Afghanistan, somebody speaking up in the Middle East. The Jews are the problems of the world. If it wasn't for the Jews, if it wasn't for the Zionists. So the prophet here says they're going to blame you for the trouble that the nations are having. And he says you're taken up with the lips of talkers. I looked up the word talkers, and it means a forked tongue, a babbler, or a slanderer. All right? The word infamy, that you're an infamy of the people, is defaming or an evil report. So in other words, they're constantly saying that the Jews are evil. They're constantly bringing an evil report about Israel in order to try to get the two nations that they want. Now, I don't know if you keep up with the news and you follow what's happening, but this is a real picture, ladies and gentlemen, of what's called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And everything that you read about, this is very important, everything you read about in the book of Ezekiel, about this war which is coming, this is important, don't you miss this, will stem from the Palestinian conflict. The war of Gog and Magog, the root of it will be what's called the Palestinian conflict. I'm telling you, based on what I see, what I know, what I read in God's Word, this is where the real situation lies right now. Now, if we continue to go, we have to ask ourselves about a battle which is going to happen. There will be a battle that I believe is going to be a result of a conflict which will arise involving Israel and the Palestinians. And this battle will be over the land of Israel, and it's called the Battle of Gog and Magog. This is Ezekiel chapters 38 and chapter 39. Now, here's the timing of this battle. Look at this, and the producer will put this on the screen where you can see it. It will happen after many days. It will happen in the latter days. It will happen when the land is brought back from the sword. It will happen when Israel dwells safely. It will happen when they dwell in a land of unwalled villages. It will happen when the Israel dwells where there are no walls, gates, or bars in their cities. And it will happen when the people are dwelling safely, or when they have some form of security. All of those passages indicate the following: that this battle will happen, number one, when Israel is restored as a nation, and they have been. Number two, when the Jewish people have security. Now, we're on a tour here with the tour group, and we can go anywhere we want to go. We eat wherever we want to eat. Haven't seen any difficulties. And the people of Israel are now dwelling in cities with unwalled villages. In other words, there's no bars, there's no walls up. You go into a city, you drive through. And so everything I'm sharing with you, this could not have happened in Ezekiel's day. In his day, all cities had walls around them. You couldn't come into the city without coming through the city gate. This is a last day prophecy. So now we see that we're getting set up. The scene is being set for the battle. Now, let's get into some real interesting teaching here. Here's somebody in this battle by the name of Gog, G-O-G. This is a mysterious person, and there's a lot that's been written. Who is Gog? In fact, I want to ask a couple questions here. The word Gog in the English Bible, G-O-G, is mentioned 2 times, and it's Ezekiel 38:2 and 39:1, and he's called Gog, the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal. Now, who in the world is Gog? There's been a lot of speculation, so here's what we're going to answer. Who is Gog? What is meant by the phrase chief prince, and where is the land of Magog? First of all, let's look at the word Gog. That's not the first place it appears in the Bible in the book of Ezekiel. It appears in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 and verse 4, and he was a descendant of Reuben, and his name is called Gog. Now, that's the only place he's mentioned in the Old Testament in the English translation of the Bible, with the exception of Ezekiel 38 and 39. He's mentioned 9 times in those 2 chapters in relating to this war with Israel, which is going to take place. Now, there's one verse that puzzles scholars. It's in chapter 38, I believe it's verse 17, where God says about Gog, "Are you not the one I have told the prophets of old about?" Well, you know, you start reading all over the Old Testament and you find nothing listed about this man. Now, that's a curiosity in itself. But let's go on and talk about this for just a moment. Who is Gog? Of the ancient giants was a man by the name of Anak, A-N-A-K. Now, in the book of Numbers, here's what it says. He shall pour water out of his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters, and his king shall be exalted higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. So in other words, I'm reading that to tell you that in the Septuagint, which is the Old Testament translated to the Greek language, they translate Agag there as the word Gog. They say Gog in that particular passage. Now, here's another interesting passage from the Old Testament, also from the Septuagint translation. Amos chapter 7, verse 1. Listen to this one. Thus the Lord showed me, and behold, a swarm of locusts were coming, and one of the devastating locusts was Gog the king. It translates here the word Gog in the Septuagint translation of the Bible. It's going to be different in the English translation, but the Septuagint is the Old Testament translated to the Greek language. So what's interesting is 2 places in the Septuagint the word Gog is mentioned. Now, I'm not going to go into the theological purposes or reasons why it was translated that way, but my point is, God said to Ezekiel, "I have spoken in ancient time about him." So somewhere, something was known about this person called Gog. Now, here's another reason why I personally believe that Gog is not a man, Gog is a principality. You ready for this? Because the war of Ezekiel 38 and 39... Gog reappears in the latter part of the book of Revelation at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. He reappears, stirring up the people of Gog, Magog, Meshach, and you read it in the book of Revelation. In fact, I've got the verse here. Let me just read it to you. And he reappears at 1,000 years after the millennial reign of Christ. Watch this. Here's the verse. He shall go forth to deceive the nations, and this is when Satan is loosed from the pit at the end of the 1,000 years, which are in the four quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to battle, the number of them who is the sand of the sea. And of course, they come up against the city of Jerusalem. The Bible said fire comes down from God out of heaven to devour them, Revelation 28 and 9. So how can Gog be a part of this battle, which is going to happen in the near future? And then how can he reappear at the end of the 1,000-year reign of Christ? If he's a man and he's killed in battle, and he's a sinner, he's going to go into hell, and the only time he's going to come back is to stand before the great white throne judgment. Then he's cast in the lake of fire. How does he reappear? If he's a spirit that's bound when Satan is bound, and then Satan is released and those spirits are released, then it stands to reason Gog is not just a man. Gog is a prince spirit. He is the prince of darkness. He's a demonic spirit directly under Satan. Now, I personally believe that this Gog, who is the chief prince, that chief prince alludes there not just to a leader, an earthly leader. Of course, principalities work through personalities. Gog, the spirit's going to have to work through a person, absolutely. But Gog may actually be some form of a demonic spirit. Now, let's talk about this. Look at the nations that are going to be involved in that great battle that day when it happens here. The Bible in the book of Ezekiel lists the nations, and there's a real clue that I'm going to tell you about that connects all these nations listed together. Watch this carefully. First is the nation of Persia. We know that that's Iran. It was called Persia until 1935. In fact, it was named Persia in the 9th century BC. They'll be involved. So the Iranians will be involved in this war. Number two, Ethiopia. The Hebrew word there is Cush. Cush, and that has reference not only to the area of Ethiopia in northern Africa, but it has reference in the ancient time to what is today called the Sudan. Oh my, you know about the Islamic fanaticism that's taken place in Sudan and how they are linked with some of the other fanatical Islamic countries. Isn't that interesting? So here we have another nation listed. Libya is listed. The Hebrew word is put, and that happens to be the country of Libya in northern Africa. The country Gomer is mentioned as one of the nations that will attack Israel in this battle. And these are the Germanic tribes in various parts of Europe. In fact, Gomer, ancient writings talk about Gomer. They call them the Gomerites. They were the ancient Cimmerians who were expelled about 700 BC from southern Turkey. The Babylonian Talmud talks about Gomer and it renders it as Germania or Germany, and it was an area that was established between two of the rivers there in Europe. So in other words, it appears that Germany has some form of a link when this battle begins to take place, or at least certain parts of that part of the world does. Now let's go a step further. It talks about the house of Togarmah. Now Togarmah in Ezekiel's day, there was a place called Cappadocia, which is in modern Turkey. And there was a city, this is interesting, that was known in Ezekiel's day in Turkey as Togarmah or Takarma, which is very similar to the word Togarmah, which is used here in the book of Ezekiel. So we understand that there will be parts of Turkey, absolutely, that are also going to be involved in this war, all the way toward Armenia, southern part of Russia. I'll talk about that in a moment. Meshech and Tubal, many scholars trace that to Moscow and Tobolsk, which is located in Russia. Others trace it to ancient cities which were located in the edge of eastern Turkey. So when we sum this up, here's the part that you really got to catch. When we sum this up, every nation that was just listed, okay, if we could talk about Iran, if we talk about Libya, if we talk about Germania or the German tribes, if we talk about every country listed, do you understand that 50 years ago, all of those countries were pro-Western? That 50 years ago, Iran had a man, a wonderful man who was like a monarch over that country that was pro-Western. Do you realize every country I've just named, Jewish people used to live there before 1948? Do you realize that every country I named has one common link? All those countries in Ezekiel 38 and 38 that will come against Israel and fight them have one link. They are now all Muslim. And certain parts of the world where these countries are listed are fanatical Muslims. And so here's what you really end up with. When you end up to where in Ezekiel's day, when he was given this prophecy, and you go and study a map, you discover that the northern part of Africa, you will discover that the eastern part of Turkey, and yes, the southern part of Russia. Here's what's interesting about the southern part of Russia. The southern part of Russia has 5 states. Remember, Russia broke apart, right? Soviet Union broke apart, actually. And 5 states that are all Islamic, that were all a part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, that all are linked into Turkey, are all 5 southern states in Russia, I believe, are going to be a part of this war. And really, if you start looking at where the ancient tribes are from, it could actually stretch into Persia, which could also stretch into Iran and Pakistan. So in other words, can I just tell you what the invasion of Gog and Magog is? You ready? It is an Islamic invasion. It is Muslim nations with fanatical leaders coming together thinking they can defeat Israel. Now I want to stop for a moment and tell you something. When Israel fought the war in Lebanon, I began to read, in fact, before I even came over here to tape this, there was an article that the president of Iran said that in the war, Hezbollah defeated 50% of the Israeli military and destroyed 50% of Israel. I asked one of my guides how much damage was done with missiles that came in. He said, well, there were 7,000 missiles that came into the northern part of Israel. He said, but really a lot of them just hit the land and blew up. He said, we had to go look for buildings that were damaged. He said, I took a bunch of people that wanted to go see it after the war, and they said, we have to take a left, take a right, take a left, and you'll see a building. Go up here, take a left and a right and a left. I said, wait a minute, you mean the whole northern part was not destroyed? He said, absolutely not. And the Iranian president believed and is now telling his people 50% of Israel was destroyed in the war. I don't know what pictures he's looking at, but somebody's deceiving the man. But did you know what God said? I'll make you think an evil thought. Then I'll turn you back and then bring you down. Hello. The evil thought just might be they can destroy Israel. You got to trust me with something. There's no way these Islamic countries would ever come into this territory and attack Israel unless they thought they could win. And I believe that war in Lebanon was a setup. And that war was to make these people think, you know what, we can do it now. Look at what Hezbollah did. We can do it now. But what they don't understand is when that old bear from the north comes into Israel, he's going to meet the Lion of Judah.